Hi everyone, and welcome to Daily Revelations. This is a weekly Bible study where we go through one book of the Bible at a time using precept methods. And we are on the book of Daniel right now, starting out Daniel 6. Now this may be a little strange than most of the weeks because this is Labor Day week, at least when I'm recording. So I took Monday off, which is the first day of our study. So I'm going to start on day 2 of our study since I didn't do a video yesterday or a recording. So we're diving into just some methods that the author has used in this chapter and looking at it and looking at the literary techniques that this author used to kind of pull out or extract some more truth from that and prayerfully put that before God. And so as I was reading through it with that context this morning, Daniel 6 is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So we're going to have a lot of really interesting discussions because I'm sure a lot of you know this story well. And if you don't, you'll probably have heard some reference to it at least. But maybe you haven't read through it 7 times and seeing what else there is within this chapter that God has to speak to your heart this week. The thing that I pulled out of the literary part of it is the comparison contrast. It is definitely a story, but from the perspective of Daniel. But it also compares and contrasts 2 very different people, and that's what really came out to me. And there's 4 different verses that I want to point out that really I put, when I mark my Bible with comparison contrast, I put a little CC, comparison contrast. That's typical for precept methods. So just know if you do that, that is what I usually do. So the first one is in verse 3. They talk about Daniel having an extraordinary spirit. And then, of course, everybody else has an ordinary spirit. So that's the first comparison contrast. The second one is in verse 4. Daniel was considered faithful with nothing that he could be accused of. Yet, we find out that everyone else that is working against him is corrupt and very negligent because they were looking for what seemed to be normal in humans. But yet Daniel was free of those things that they could find. And finally, in verses 22 and 24, we see that Daniel is innocent. And yet, the people who worked against him were called malicious. They had envy and evil intentions. Definitely 2 different groups of people. And as I was looking at this and praying through it and saying, God, what lesson do you have for me? And I don't know if you heard last week, but I just had a horrible week. There were a lot of people that let me down, and I just really felt a lot of conflict in my life and all of these things. And here is Daniel, and he proves in his life the truth of God, even when everything else goes against him. And it just gave me some resolve today that, you know what, people can do what they want to do, but that should not affect my story. It should not affect the truth that I believe in and that I choose to stand firm in. Instead, I want to be like Daniel, even if God would choose to put me in a place where my life is at danger. And I've had this temporary tattoo on my leg for about a week and a half, and it just seems so fitting to quote today. Faith doesn't make things easy. It makes things possible. And that is so true of what Daniel's life was a lot about. His life wasn't easy. It definitely wasn't one filled with just a nice promotion and everybody was, spoke highly of him and loved him. No, they really hated him. And yet he chose to continue to follow God and be faithful. And it is our stories. I'm reading a book now called Known, and one of the quotes from the author, his name is Dick Foth, he says, "Stories wrap flesh around truth." And that's so true. So many people will not read the Bible, or they will not spend enough time to allow the Holy Spirit to convict them of truth. Just like the king. King Darius was that way. But was King Darius convicted of truth? Yes, he was. Because the life that Daniel chose to live. His story lived out the truth of who God was, whether King Darius chose to follow God or not. And that is what we are called to do. We are called to be those living stories of truth to everyone who's watching us, whether they treat us well or not. And that's the hard part, is that we don't have the option to say, well, only if this person does what I want, or only if they are nice to me, that I will live out the truth of God. No, because then it doesn't prove God to be true. It just proves us to be, well, that we like what's happening in the moment, and we'll follow along. Faith doesn't make things easy. It makes them possible. And we have to live in faith, and we have to walk in faith, and we have to show the truth of God through our stories. And that's hard. It's really hard sometimes. And yes, God gives us resting places, and then he tells us to just go into the muck of the lion's den and just trust him. So I don't know where your life is at today, and what you might be going through, whether you are in a nice place or in a not so good place. But I promise God is faithful, and he will see you through, and his truth will always win, because he's already won. So just be encouraged, and just keep on keeping on. I will see you again tomorrow as we continue the study of Daniel 6. Thanks for joining me today on Daily Revelations, and I'll see you tomorrow.